Meantime, fears remain high of a possible escalation in President Trump's trade war after he threatened an additional 100% tariff on Chinese goods.
President Trump says the U.S. is imposing an additional 100% tariff on imports from China starting November 1st.
Now, the U.S. President Donald Trump's tariffs are complicating global trade, with critics calling them arbitrary.
The global economy woke up to chaos. Markets plunged, trading floors fell silent, and news outlets across the world blared the same headline: China strikes back. After weeks of escalating rhetoric, Beijing officially announced a staggering 500% tariff on key U.S. exports, a direct and deliberate counterattack against Washington's sweeping 100% tariffs on Chinese goods. President Donald Trump had promised to rebalance trade between the two superpowers. He framed his tariffs as a defense of American workers, a way to stop what he called decades of economic surrender. But this time, China didn't flinch. Instead, it hit harder than anyone expected. The move stunned Wall Street. Futures collapsed overnight, oil prices tumbled, and the U.S. dollar weakened sharply as traders tried to make sense of what had just happened. For years, the U.S. and China have circled each other in a tense economic dance. Tariffs, sanctions, diplomatic protests, cyber accusations. But this moment felt different. This was not a negotiation tactic. It was a declaration of economic war. In Washington, officials scrambled to respond. Early briefings at the White House described the Chinese measures as extreme retaliation. Trump's closest advisors, flanked by economic and defense aides, met deep into the night. Behind closed doors, the message was blunt. This confrontation could redefine global trade for decades. Beijing's 500% tariff wasn't symbolic. It targeted the lifeblood of American exports: agricultural products, industrial machinery, and advanced technology components. Overnight, billions in U.S. goods became too expensive to sell in China. For American farmers already struggling under previous trade restrictions, it was devastating. Corn, soybeans, pork, and dairy, industries that formed the backbone of Trump's rural voter base, suddenly lost their biggest overseas customer. Within hours, agricultural lobbies began warning of mass bankruptcies. Meanwhile, China's Ministry of Commerce delivered its official statement to the world. The United States must understand that economic coercion will not bring prosperity. If Washington chooses confrontation, China will defend its interests with determination. Those words reverberated across capitals from Tokyo to Berlin. Analysts immediately noted the scale of the escalation. A 500% tariff was not simply punitive, it was strategic. A calculated strike meant to cripple key American industries while showing global markets that China could absorb pain and inflict it too. For President Trump, this was supposed to be the moment America took back control. His administration had already announced 100% tariffs on Chinese electronics, solar panels, electric vehicles, and medical devices, calling it a defense of American manufacturing. But Beijing's retaliation changed the equation. Inside the Oval Office, aides debated whether to double down or de-escalate. Trump, however, remained defiant. Reporters captured his brief but charged response on the White House lawn. China's had a free ride for too long. If they want a trade war, we'll win it. We always do. Yet markets didn't share his confidence. By midweek, the Dow Jones had fallen more than 1,800 points. Asian exchanges suffered similar losses. The ripple effects spread quickly, disrupting currencies, commodities, and investor confidence around the world. This wasn't just about tariffs. It was about control of the future. The technologies at the center of this fight, semiconductors, batteries, and rare earth elements, power everything from smartphones to fighter jets. Both nations knew whoever dominated these industries would control the next century's economy. That's where China's next move came in. State media announced new restrictions on rare earth exports, including lithium, neodymium, and praseodymium, critical ingredients for semiconductors and electric vehicle batteries. Few outside the tech sector realized just how dependent the modern world had become on these minerals. China processes nearly 90% of global rare earths, and that dominance gives it immense leverage. Without these materials, factories across the US, Europe, and Japan could grind to a halt. Economists at the Financial Times warned that this was the most potent weapon in Beijing's arsenal. By restricting rare earth exports, China could paralyze industries far beyond American borders, a move that would echo through supply chains for years. In Washington, the implications were immediate and alarming. Internal memos from the Department of Energy revealed that U.S. reserves of these minerals would last less than a year if China fully halted exports. Tech executives rushed to emergency meetings with government officials, seeking clarity and contingency plans. Despite the panic, Trump's advisors publicly insisted the U.S. could withstand the pressure. They argued this was the price of economic independence. But privately, even seasoned strategists admitted the scale of the challenge was unprecedented. Inside China, the mood was shifting as well. For years, Beijing had walked a careful line, avoiding direct confrontation while benefiting from global trade. But now, that restraint appeared to be fading. Reports from Chinese state outlets described high-level meetings chaired by President Xi Jinping, where the message was resolute. If Washington tried to choke China's growth, Beijing would prove it could choke the world's technology supply in return. Those words, delivered to senior officials and military leaders, were more than rhetoric. They reflected a broader transformation, a nation no longer seeking approval or compromise, but asserting itself as a global equal. Meanwhile, in Washington, Trump's inner circle began crafting countermeasures. Advisors proposed a massive $400 billion initiative to secure America's technological independence. Plans were drawn up for new semiconductor plants in Arizona and Ohio, expanded lithium mining in Nevada, and the establishment of a national rare earth reserve. But even with these bold moves, experts warned that results could take years. The confrontation was unfolding now, and global markets were already unraveling. Across the Atlantic, panic spread through Europe. Germany's auto industry, already struggling with the green energy transition, now faced a potential collapse. Without Chinese lithium and magnesium, electric vehicle production could stall completely. Emergency meetings were held in Berlin as automakers warned that a prolonged disruption could trigger a deep recession by spring. Europe had long relied on China for the raw materials of its industrial power. And now, that dependence looked like a trap. Inside Beijing, however, state media launched a new slogan: "Made in China for China." The phrase symbolized a pivot, a national campaign towards self-sufficiency. The government allocated over 1 trillion yuan to expand domestic microchip production and rare metal refining facilities. The message was unmistakable. China was preparing for a world where cooperation with the West could no longer be relied upon. Back in Washington, the administration wasn't ready to concede ground. According to reports from Politico, officials began drafting a comprehensive export ban on all dual-use technologies, systems that could be used for both civilian and military purposes. That included artificial intelligence software, quantum computing tools, and advanced manufacturing systems. Technologies seen as vital to the industries of tomorrow. A special White House task force was formed to explore what analysts called a technological embargo. Economists compared the potential fallout to the 1970s oil crisis, when supply shocks reshaped the global order overnight. The stakes couldn't be higher. The world's two largest economies were locking into a struggle that went far beyond trade. It was a contest for dominance, over technology, resources, and the direction of globalization itself. The world was changing faster than anyone could process. With tariffs soaring, export bans multiplying, and global supply chains crumbling, the foundations of modern trade were beginning to fracture. Economists warned of a new dual economy taking shape, one orbiting around Washington, the other anchored in Beijing. For decades, globalization had promised efficiency and interdependence. But that promise was collapsing under the weight of geopolitical rivalry. Corporations started drawing new maps. Factories once designed to serve all markets now built two versions of the same product, one for the West, another for China. Every major company, from automakers to chip makers, began preparing for a world divided in two. Costs were soaring, efficiency was plummeting, but no one wanted to be caught on the wrong side of history. In the United States, the effects were already visible. Inflation spiked as imported goods became scarce and expensive. Shelves that once overflowed with electronics, tools, and consumer tech were suddenly bare. Manufacturers struggled to find replacements for Chinese components. At the same time, Beijing was facing its own pain. Factories slowed, investment dipped, and millions of Chinese workers felt the pressure of shrinking exports. But unlike in Washington, where private companies dictated strategy, China's state-driven economy allowed leaders to coordinate a national response. Beijing poured billions into domestic innovation. Universities were ordered to fast-track research into semiconductors, robotics, and alternative materials. State banks unleashed credit lines to keep strategic industries afloat. The message from the top was clear: China would endure, adapt, and outlast. In a televised speech to the National People's Congress, Xi Jinping declared, "The era of dependence on foreign technology is over. China will build, not borrow, the tools of its future." His words drew thunderous applause and sent another tremor through global markets. Across the developing world, a quiet realignment was taking place. Nations weary of Western sanctions and wary of U.S. dominance began gravitating toward Beijing's orbit. The BRICS alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, expanded talks on a shared payment system to bypass the U.S. dollar. Russia, already deep in confrontation with the West, embraced the crisis as an opportunity. Together with China, it began promoting energy trade in yuan and rubles. Within months, more than 30 countries signaled willingness to adopt the alternative system for oil and gas transactions. For Washington, the implications were chilling. The dollar's role as the world's reserve currency, a pillar of American power, was facing its most serious challenge in decades. Meanwhile, China and Saudi Arabia strengthened energy ties, launching joint ventures in refining and battery technology. India, balancing between both powers, quietly expanded semiconductor partnerships with American firms while keeping trade channels with Beijing open. The world was no longer unipolar. It was splintering into networks, each led by competing superpowers. In Washington, the tone hardened. President Trump unveiled what he called the Freedom Production Act, a sweeping policy to bring manufacturing back to U.S. soil. The government promised tax breaks for companies that repatriated jobs and penalties for those that continued producing in China. Massive construction projects began in the American Midwest and Southwest. New semiconductor plants, lithium processing facilities, and robotics labs. States like Arizona, Ohio, and Texas became symbols of the administration's industrial revival plan. But the transformation came at a cost. With global trade fractured, raw materials became scarce. Prices for metals and minerals soared, driving inflation higher. Critics warned that the cure was becoming more painful than the disease. Still, in speeches across the Rust Belt, Trump remained steadfast. "We're not backing down. We're building the future right here in America." To his supporters, it was a patriotic call to arms. To economists, it sounded like a gamble that could either save or sink the U.S. economy. Across the Atlantic, Europe faced its own reckoning. German automakers, long dependent on Chinese batteries and parts, saw production lines falter. France and Italy scrambled to secure mineral supplies from Africa, only to find that China had already locked in most of the key mining contracts. The European Union convened emergency summits in Brussels to discuss strategic autonomy, the idea that Europe must no longer rely on either Washington or Beijing. But unity was hard to find. Some nations leaned toward the U.S., others sought compromise with China to protect their industries. For the first time in decades, Europe's role as a global economic power was in doubt. Meanwhile, Canada and Mexico were drawn deeper into the crossfire. Ottawa faced mounting pressure from both sides. After aligning with U.S. tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, Canada became the target of Beijing's retaliatory measures, including steep duties on canola and other agricultural exports. No country benefits from permanent trade war. At the same time, automakers in Ontario and Quebec faced devastating news. Major companies like Stellantis and Ford were shifting production to the U.S. to avoid future tariffs. Thousands of Canadian jobs hung in the balance. Trade ministers from all three North American nations met repeatedly in Washington to stabilize the situation, exploring sector-specific agreements for steel, aluminum, and energy. But progress was slow. By autumn, the global picture had darkened. Shipping routes, once bustling with goods, now ran half-empty. Container prices skyrocketed. The World Bank revised its growth forecast downward for nearly every major economy. In boardrooms and parliaments alike, leaders began using a new phrase: the economic Cold War. Because that's what this had become, a contest not of armies or missiles, but of tariffs, technology, and resources. The similarities to the mid-20th century were uncanny. Competing alliances, economic blockades, propaganda wars fought on social media and in financial markets. Only this time, the battlefield was digital, and every nation was entangled in the web. As the standoff dragged on, cracks began to appear in unexpected places. American farmers, once among Trump's strongest supporters, grew restless. Massive surpluses of unsold crops piled up across the Midwest. Federal subsidies provided short-term relief, but not enough to offset collapsing Chinese demand. At the same time, Chinese factories producing for Western brands began closing or relocating to Southeast Asia. Vietnam, Indonesia, and India saw surges in investment as companies sought safer ground. But that shift came with consequences: higher costs, weaker infrastructure, and growing political tension in the region. The globalized system that had driven decades of prosperity was unraveling thread by thread. Then, an unexpected twist. China announced the creation of an Asian Economic Security Coalition, inviting nations from the Pacific and Central Asia to join a framework focused on mutual trade defense. Analysts saw it as Beijing's attempt to formalize its sphere of influence, a direct rival to America's alliances. The U.S. responded by deepening ties with traditional allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, promising advanced defense cooperation and economic aid packages. Both sides framed their actions as defensive, but the world could feel the chill of a new era settling in. For ordinary people, the geopolitical chess match translated into everyday hardship. Families in America paid more for groceries, electronics, and cars. Workers in China faced layoffs as export orders dried up. Developing nations saw rising food prices and currency shocks. The trade war wasn't just a battle of policy. It was a stress test for the entire global system. Yet amid the uncertainty, one truth became undeniable: neither side could afford to lose. The United States and China were now locked in a cycle of retaliation and resistance that neither could easily escape. Every tariff, every sanction, every speech carried the weight of history. By year's end, markets had stabilized somewhat, but confidence had not returned. The confrontation had redrawn the economic map, forcing governments and corporations to rethink everything from energy policy to supply security. And while negotiations quietly resumed in neutral capitals, the underlying tension remained, a low hum of rivalry echoing through boardrooms, military briefings, and diplomatic halls alike. The global order that had defined the post-Cold War era was gone. In its place stood a fragmented world, shaped by competition and mistrust. As one analyst put it, we are witnessing the birth of a new economic age, not built on cooperation, but on containment. And for both Washington and Beijing, the question was no longer who would blink first, but how much damage the world could endure before someone finally did. The U.S.-China confrontation is still unfolding, with consequences that could define the next generation of global power. What's your take? Is this the beginning of a permanent economic divide, or will diplomacy pull the world back from the brink? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to stay ahead of these global shifts, make sure to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter of this rapidly changing story.